My mother was in the front bedroom. My grandmother was across in the hallway, and both had been bludgeoned to death. So that makes no sense to me on a burglary, because even if you get spooked, why wouldn't you just grab that cash and go?
Right.
So there's been different theories over the years and different accusations, but there's nothing solid.
My name is Skylar Henry. I'm an investigative reporter researching unsolved cases across Maryland, shedding light on stories of victims and their families and speaking with law enforcement agencies stuck with little clues and nowhere to go. This is Maryland Mysteries. It's snowing out here right now. It wasn't the case in October 1989. Still, this neighborhood is relatively quiet. A lot of the houses are close together, and so when someone threw a brick through the back door of this house here on Maxer Road, it alerted neighbors, but no one noticed anything until the next morning.
For the first time in 27 years, a World Series game will be played in Candlestick Park.
So where this story actually begins is 3,000 miles across the country in California. It was Game 3 of the 1989 World Series. The Oakland Athletics were up 2 games against the San Francisco Giants in that series when that historic earthquake shook the stadium minutes before players took to the field.
I'll tell you what, we're having an earthquake.
Caused pandemonium all across the country, and it was the lead story in all network news broadcasts at the time. Well, happening across the country at that exact same time, a woman named Ann First was saying goodbye to her husband, Rudolph. She and her family had been hosting a wake in Churchville, Maryland, a rural city about 45 minutes north of Baltimore.
They went over to Miss Wilma's house for the wake and probably spent about an hour and a half, so like 10:30, everybody kind of remembers. They left to go back from Churchville to Aberdeen. So they drove from Churchville to Aberdeen. We're guessing about a half hour kind of transfers to get them there. Pull in and begin their nighttime ritual to get ready. The funeral
For this case, we sat down with one of Harford County's lead detectives on cold cases, Detective Tammy Burns. She actually took over the case 3 years ago. Burns says Ann and her daughter Helen were in the family's Maxer Road home in for the night. Rudolph's funeral was in the morning, and so Ann went to bed as Helen stayed up to watch some TV and enjoy a nightcap. Then suddenly, a brick came flying through the back door.
So either it was a loud popping, a loud bang, or glass breaking, as the descriptions we pick up from every neighbor that lived in that street and the 3 to 4 streets, both behind it, front it, and on the sides. They then hear, right after the glass break, a female scream. Neighbors all flip on their lights, because back in '89, that's what you would do, is you kind of looked around. You didn't jump right to calling 911 or your local police. You did an investigation your kind of yourself.
If you let the folks in Aberdeen tell it,
I'll tell you that in the 80s, calling 911 wasn't the first thing that people jumped to doing. They kind of did their own snooping around, trying to do their own investigative work to assess a situation before they felt like they needed to call police. And so police weren't called. The next morning, the rest of Helen's family came down from Connecticut for Rudolph's funeral. That included her then 19-year-old daughter, Maribeth.
I remember most of it. I remember walking in and finding them. I remember, arriving at the house and not being able to get in, knocking on the door, and my father asking my brother to go around the back.
I sat down for a FaceTime interview with Maribeth, who uses a victimology course to try and cope through the pain of losing both her mother and her grandparents in such a short amount of time. Maribeth, who's now in her 40s, remembers the moments clearly.
So I saw them. I remember seeing my mother. She was sitting in a chair up against the wall, and she had been beaten in the head. So I do recall seeing that. And that was, very quickly my father got us out of the house. I remember leaving the house and screaming, and the neighbors coming out, and what happened.
Ann and Helen were beaten to death. The lights inside their home on Maxer Road still on, and the glass was shattered at the foot of the back door.
Miss Ann, who was 83 years old, was found right inside the door on the ground, hit several times in the head. We're not sure what the weapon is. Weapon was not left on the scene, and it was sent out to the FBI at the time their lab to see if they could come back with some tool marks off of pictures. And there was a wall behind Helen that had been hit, who was further back in the bedroom in a chair, to see if we could match it up. Best they can come up with is it's some type of pipe or crowbar, something metal. Miss Helen had come into the room after hearing the shattering of the glass. We can only suspect that's probably what she did if she left the room. And that's when he basically had both of them, or he or she had both of them.
Aberdeen police officers were the first to respond, but they quickly realized that this case was a little too big for them, and it also wasn't in their jurisdiction necessarily. So they called the Harford County Sheriff's Office, and investigators were quickly on the scene and determined nothing was taken. But what's worse in this case, there wasn't a drop of DNA left behind from a killer.
Neighbors were on their way to Rudolph's first funeral when they found out about the murders.
I felt like they were part family, and it's very hard to take.
In the house? Oh my God!
Our cameras were at the house the day after the two were killed. We ended up speaking to a few neighbors.
All about your own safety.
Are you kidding? I'm alone. Yeah, it certainly does. Oh my God, I can't believe this.
Maribeth lives in Ohio now with her husband, and she says that she's been doing her best to try and track down who killed her mother and grandmother the day before her grandfather's funeral. But it's been tough on her, as she's sometimes found herself going about investigating this case alone.
Because I think I got to a point where I was like, nothing's happening. They've changed detectives many times over the years. It's great to see that they now have a group of detectives looking at cold cases, so that does give me hope, because this is the first time that there's really been any focus, and he's really been an advocate he's like ready to solve it. It's like, we need to figure this out, find out who did it.
And it's a mystery puzzling the sheriff's office, who've been using that memorable night, that night of that earthquake in that big World Series game in October 1989, to try and track down a killer.
What happens if the person who did this is no longer here? If he or she may have passed away? I mean, it has been 30 years. Is that something that you would be at peace with, or would that bother you even more?
Yeah, no, I think I'd still be at peace with it, because there's been speculation of prisoners that have either come forward that have since committed suicide or died, or I think just knowing the why, to me, is the most important. And maybe I guess you would never know the why if they're dead, but at least if there was solid evidence to prove that that was the individual, then closure, I guess that's about the best I would get. It'd be nice if they were still alive to face them, but I would take anything at this point.